Julian Vance never wanted this meeting. He sat at the mahogany table, calculating the exact minute he could politely excuse himself and leave. Across from him sat Elena Croft. Her smile was flawless, the kind of diplomatic warmth practiced over years of high-pressure corporate environments. The Obsidian Lounge hummed with low jazz and the faint clinking of crystal. It was a perfectly stifling atmosphere for two strangers pretending to care. Julian nodded at a mundane comment she made. His deep blue eyes revealed nothing but cold, engineered courtesy, a fortress built over years. Elena subtly shifted her weight. Beneath the elegant dark green jacket, she was exhausted, carrying an invisible, heavy burden she shared with no one. They navigated the safe, sterile waters of conversation, occupations, quiet neighborhoods, the predictable rhythm of two successful adults meticulously avoiding real connection. Beneath the heavy wooden table, Julian subtly checked his watch. 10 more minutes. Just 10 more minutes, and he could retreat to his silent house. But then, the predictable rhythm abruptly shattered. Elena's hand hovered over her ceramic espresso cup, and her polished, diplomatic smile slowly dissolved. She looked directly into him, her emerald eyes suddenly piercing through his carefully constructed defenses. A heavy, absolute silence settled between them. "Do you believe," she asked with a quiet intensity, "that a single, random conversation can completely alter the trajectory of a person's life?" Julian was taken aback. The carefully mapped exit plan in his mind suddenly derailed as he processed the weight of her words. He leaned back slightly, offering a measured, guarded response about how it depended on both the conversation and the person. Elena nodded slowly. She began to speak of her work at the crisis center, her voice devoid of its earlier corporate gloss. She confessed that her entire career path was born from a single evening, exactly a decade ago, that rearranged everything she knew about herself. She broke eye contact, looking down at her hands. The stifling lounge suddenly felt profoundly intimate, stripped of its previous pretenses. Her fingers traced the rim of her espresso cup. It was the stillness of someone carefully unearthing a memory they rarely touched. Julian watched her intently. His hands rested on the table, still and grounded, the urge to check his watch had completely vanished. She spoke of a cold October night. She mentioned the riverside park, her voice quiet, sketching the shape of a rainy darkness. It wasn't a full story yet, just a fragile offering of a deeply buried wound, laid bare over the mahogany table. With a small, weary smile, she mentioned a stranger who had sat down on the bench beside her, pulling her back from the edge. Julian sat completely frozen. The atmospheric hum of the lounge faded into a dull, distant ring in his ears as the pieces clicked together. He remembered that exact October night vividly. The biting cold, the relentless drizzle, the suffocating weight of a silent sentence handed to him by a doctor. He remembered fleeing the clinical white hallways of the hospital, utterly unable to go home and face the fragile reality waiting for him. He remembered wandering aimlessly to Riverside Park, finding a secluded wooden bench, and collapsing into the enveloping shadows. And he remembered the young woman already sitting there, clutching a bag against her side with a terrifying, absolute stillness. A decade had passed. The fragile stranger from the rain was now sitting across from him, entirely unaware of the collision of their fates. Julian deliberately lowered his hands beneath the mahogany table, ensuring she couldn't see the sudden, uncontrollable tremor in his fingers. He forced his expression to remain dangerously neutral. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was carefully stripped of all emotion. "Was it drizzling?" he asked, his tone low and flat. "A light, freezing rain?" Elena stopped breathing. The warm amber light caught the sudden, sharp narrowing of her emerald eyes as the impossible question registered. The change in Elena's expression wasn't immediate. She set her cup down with a careful, terrifying deliberateness, buying herself a fraction of a second. She stared at him, her mind racing to process an impossibility that was simply too large to comprehend all at once. "How would you know that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, yet sharp enough to cut through the heavy air. Julian hesitated. He thought about lying, about saying he was just guessing that October nights in the city were often drizzly. It would have been so incredibly easy to fold the moment back up, to let them both go home to their safe, lonely routines. But he looked at her carefully constructed defenses and realized he was utterly exhausted from hiding. "I was there," he stated softly. The silence between them stretched into eternity. The ordinary machinery of the lounge continued around them, entirely oblivious to the earthquake at their table. Elena's posture stiffened. She lifted her chin, a micro-expression of defiance, refusing to let herself be rattled in a public space. "That is a very specific claim to make to someone you just met," she said, her voice dropping into a flat, professional tone. "Tall guy," Julian countered quietly, holding her gaze. "Dark jacket, no hood. I asked you a stupid question about closing time. And I asked about your blue scarf." The controlled expression on Elena's face finally cracked, a hairline fracture appearing in her perfect porcelain facade. Her hand instinctively moved toward her coffee cup again, then stopped mid-air, trembling with an unseen nervous energy. Julian didn't push further. As an architect, he knew perfectly well when a structure had taken enough pressure before collapsing entirely. "It had a little knot in the fringe on the left side," Julian added, his voice barely a whisper. "You kept touching it." Elena looked at him for a long, agonizing moment, the immense weight of the past anchoring them firmly to the mahogany table. Then, she turned her gaze toward the window. The street outside had gone fully dark while they weren't paying attention. The corner street lamp was now wrapped in the first yellow leaves of autumn, glowing warmly against the cold evening glass. She was buying time, desperately needing something external to focus on while she decided what to do with this impossible truth. "I don't even know your last name," she finally exhaled, her voice stripped of all its previous armor, sounding terribly exhausted. "Vance. Julian Vance," he replied quietly. She slowly turned back to face him. "Why were you there that night, Julian?" Julian looked down at the table. He began turning his own cup slowly in his hands, a nervous gesture he unconsciously mirrored from her. He told her he had been at the hospital.
I didn't know then.
He said his wife had been sick.
The hardest part is knowing I could have done something differently.
He used the word sick because he still wasn't ready to use the clinical, devastating word that accurately described her condition that October. Elena heard the immense, crushing weight behind that simple word and wisely chose not to push for the painful specifics. He confessed that he couldn't go home, couldn't look at his wife's face knowing what the doctors had just told him. "You had no idea," Elena stated quietly. It wasn't an accusation, just a profound realization of his innocence that night. "None," Julian replied, finally meeting her eyes. "I just thought you were someone else who couldn't sleep." Then, Elena said something he was entirely unprepared for. "I had a small glass vial in my bag." She said it directly, without any decoration, using the clinical tone she reserved for her crisis center work. "I wasn't there because I couldn't sleep. I was there because I was holding a one-way ticket, and I didn't want to go home either." She paused, a faint shadow of a smile returning. "And then you sat down and asked your stupid question about closing time. And I laughed." She looked down at her delicate hands resting on the dark mahogany table. "That was the first time I had laughed in about 3 weeks." Julian did not speak. He let her words exist in the heavy air between them without rushing to respond, diminish, or fix them. He had learned from years of single parenting that some profound truths simply needed to be received, not solved. "You talked to me for 3 hours about absolutely nothing important," Elena continued, her voice softening with the memory. "The park, the neighborhood, whether the city should do more with the riverfront architecture.
I like this feeling.
You never once asked me if I was okay. Which was the right call, because I would have lied. She looked up, her emerald eyes locking onto his.
I wasn't ready yet.
I went home that
I
night.
decided then.
I put the vial in the bathroom cabinet, and I didn't think about it again.
After
3
all
months
these
later,
years,
I enrolled in a
I
counseling
can finally
certification
say
program.
I'm truly proud
And
of what
now we have
accomplished
14
together.
volunteer coordinators in 6 counties. She stopped, the magnitude of the realization settling over them both. All of that, is that bench. Julian had absolutely nothing to say to that. He understood, in a way that transcends language, that they had crossed a point of no return. They had shown up that evening for a perfectly ordinary, safely polite blind date. And somehow, through the quiet unraveling of the past, they had walked through a heavy, invisible door they could never go back through. He wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that, sitting there in the fading dim light of the Obsidian Lounge. But as he looked at Elena's weary, beautiful face, he knew with absolute certainty that he wasn't willing to walk away from it. They left the lounge shortly after the manager began loudly stacking chairs near the back, signaling the end of the night. Neither of them explicitly stated where they were going next. They just stepped out into the biting air and walked. The European city had that specific early October quality, cold enough to feel the bite of the season, but not yet sharply freezing. They walked side by side along the cobblestone river path, the warm streetlights reflecting in long, broken lines on the dark, moving water. Julian thought about the strange, precise geometry of 2 people moving in parallel for 10 years, only to arrive at the exact same table. He told her about his late wife, but not the carefully polished, sanitized version he usually told people to make them comfortable. Not the, "she was wonderful and I'm grateful for our time," version that he had meticulously crafted over 7 years of mourning. He told her the raw, ugly version. The version where he had been quietly, privately furious for a very long time. Furious at the randomness of the silent sentence, at feeling abandoned with a 1-year-old daughter, a mortgage, and a life built for 2. He told her about standing in his empty driveway at 2 in the morning during that first brutal, agonizing year. Because his little girl was finally asleep, and the sudden, unbearable silence of the house threatened to completely crush him. And he simply did not know where to put the immense, suffocating weight of that terrible feeling. He told her about the particular, isolating cruelty of the word, strong. How everyone constantly called him so strong. And how he eventually realized they only said it because it was easier than admitting they had absolutely no idea how to help him. Elena just listened. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him he was strong, or that his late wife sounded wonderful. Instead of offering pity, Elena asked small, precise questions. The kind that meant she was actually listening to his reality. She didn't file him away into a convenient, neat category of grief. She asked what his daughter was like at 2 years old. She asked what it felt like to walk back into his architecture firm for the very first time after his world had collapsed. She even asked what he ate for dinner during that first grueling, solitary week alone in the house. It was such a specific, strangely grounded question that Julian actually found himself laughing, a genuine, rusty sound. "Crackers," he answered, shaking his head slightly. "Crackers, peanut butter, and whatever sandwiches my friend dragged over." They eventually stopped walking. Through an unspoken agreement, they found themselves standing near a wooden bench by the water. It wasn't the exact same bench from a decade ago, but it was close enough. Elena noticed, but deliberately said nothing about it. She simply sat down, pulled her dark green jacket tighter against the October chill, and looked out at the flowing river. Julian sat down right next to her, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the dark water moving steadily under the street lamps. They sat in silence for a long time. Julian thought about the vast distance between who he had been on that bench 10 years ago, and who he was now. He wasn't entirely sure the distance was as large as it should have been. He wasn't sure he had healed as much as he pretended to. "Why haven't you been on a date in 7 years?"
What exactly do you expect me
Elena
to do
asked
now?
suddenly, her eyes still fixed on the moving water. Julian thought about the answer. The truth was heavy, layered, and incredibly difficult to articulate to someone new. "I didn't want to explain," he said finally.
You still don't understand. I don't know what
"Everything
else to say.
about my life requires a
can't keep
complicated
explaining it.
explanation." Lily,
I
the
feel like
empty
nothing
house,
more than
the
a
whole broken
tragic
shape of
story
it.
to other people.
"I got utterly tired of being a tragic story someone had to decide if they could handle." "That's
Yes, I
fair,"
know.
Elena murmured.
It's been a long
The
day.
river moved continuously in the dusk light, dark, cold, and unbroken. "I haven't been serious
I
about
suppose
anyone
I'm
in
the
3
common
years,
denominator
she
in all
confessed,
failed
her voice
relationships.
dry.
Who knew?
"My last relationship ended because he said I was too present." She said it with the flat, defensive delivery of someone who had had enough time to find the absurdity in the pain.
There's no
"I work
turning
with
back
people
from
in
this,
crisis
Julian.
all day.
We
I come
both
home
knew
and
it
I
had
want to
end
pay
this way.
absolute attention. Apparently, that is exhausting to live with." Julian processed her bitter confession. He thought about the tragic irony of a woman who saved lives being abandoned for caring too much. She picked up a small fallen autumn leaf from the bench, tracing its edges. "So I stopped trying to change," she murmured, "and just started being alone instead."
Look at
Julian didn't look away.
That story you keep
3
telling
years
yourself,
is an
the one
incredibly
that holds
long
you
time
back.
to isolate yourself,
It's
just
not
because
real.
someone was overwhelmed by your care. Elena didn't respond to that. She simply let the heavy truth exist in the cold air between them, neither confirming nor denying it. He didn't see her after that night. 3 agonizing weeks of absolute, suffocating silence passed. Julian stood in his dimly lit kitchen, staring at a cold cup of coffee, telling himself he was just too busy for complications. He used his demanding architectural projects and his single parenting duties as perfectly constructed, impenetrable walls to hide behind. But the real reason was much harder to swallow. Fear was a predictable, safe space, hope was a terrifying, unknown variable. This fragile equilibrium broke on a Thursday evening, when a phone call from a well-meaning mutual friend shattered his routine. He stood completely frozen at the kitchen counter. Elena had just received a major offer to relocate to Denver, and she was leaving. He stood at the kitchen counter for a long time after hanging up the phone. The quiet evening was already going completely dark outside his window. He thought about standing at that exact same counter for another 7 years, letting the silence slowly devour whatever was left of him. Within minutes, his hands were on the steering wheel. He navigated to the address of her organization on Broad Street without being entirely rational. Julian parked across the street. He sat in his dark car for exactly 22 minutes, intensely aware of every single ticking second. At some point, sitting in a parked car and obsessively checking the clock transitions from hesitation into a deliberate, paralyzing decision. But his hands had put the car in gear. He had driven here, and he knew that meant something undeniable. He finally got out. Meanwhile, up on the 3rd floor, Elena sat at her desk. She had been staring at the same email for the better part of an hour. The subject line read, "Denver offer, next steps." The cursor blinked steadily in the empty reply field, waiting for a final decision. She had typed and deleted the same 2 polite, professional sentences several times, unsure of what she was actually waiting for. She was methodically reminding herself that Denver was a good city when the receptionist suddenly appeared in her doorway, breaking her focus. Elena looked up,
It's impossible.
startled.
I just saw him an
The
hour
receptionist
ago.
quietly informed her that a man was waiting for her in the downstairs lobby. She walked out of her office, her heart pounding a strange, erratic rhythm against her ribs. Julian Vance was standing near the large glass windows, his hands buried deep in his dark coat pockets. He possessed the restless, constrained energy of a man who had obsessively rehearsed what he wanted to say, only to forget it entirely. She stopped a few feet away. The sterile, fluorescent lighting of the lobby offered no place to hide their mutual exhaustion. "I heard you might be leaving," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the building.
And they are asking for the updated reports.
"I might be," she replied cautiously, keeping her professional armor intact.
We need more data.
She wasn't going to make this easy for him. Julian looked down at the polished floor for a fraction of a second, gathering whatever courage he had left. "I'm not good at the part that comes after the conversation," he confessed softly. "The part where you actually have to do something about it." Elena crossed her arms, her emerald eyes watching him intensely. "Okay," she simply stated, waiting for him to bridge the gap. Julian slowly took his hands out of his pockets. He stood straighter, the way a man does when he finally decides to stop running. "That night in the park," he began, his voice steady now.
It was all my fault.
"I sat down on that bench because I had nowhere else to go. I drove around the city for an hour because I could not sit still, and I could not go home and face the inevitable.
Failure stays with you.
Then I
You'll
sat
never
next
forget
to
what
you.
you've done for me.
We talked about
means more than I
absolutely
can
nothing
say.
for 3 hours.
Thank you.
And afterward, I drove home."
I never
He took
told
a
her
slow,
this,
deliberate step
but I was
closer.
afraid of how much I loved her.
"I sat by her side while she slept,
And now it's
and for
too
the
late.
first time, I felt like I could endure it. I had absolutely no idea what heavy burden you were carrying in your bag that night," he confessed, holding her gaze. "I honestly thought I was the only one being held up." "And now," he
She's up there
gestured
right
slightly,
now.
"you're sitting up there
You have to let
deciding
me
whether
talk
to
to her
take a
before it's
flight
too
to
late."
Denver." "I sat in my car for
Understand the
20
risk may be
minutes
better
trying
than
to figure
anyone.
out if I had any right to ask you to
But I
stay."
am asking you from the bottom of my heart to believe in me one last time.
The sterile lobby felt suddenly entirely too small. Elena looked at him, truly looked at him, and her crossed arms slowly began to loosen. Elena stood entirely still, processing the magnitude of his confession. The Denver offer suddenly felt completely irrelevant. She didn't offer a dramatic declaration or a tearful embrace. She simply looked at him with profound clarity.
I was
"Don't go
wrong
to
about
Denver,"
everything.
Julian said
All
quietly,
these years
stripping
I
the
convinced
sentence of any
myself it was
remaining
worth it.
decoration.
But it wasn't.
A long moment
If we
passed.
approach this with the
Then,
necessary
Elena
caution,
spoke,
the
her voice
outcome will
steady
be
and
favorable
deliberate.
for everyone involved.
"I want to meet Lily." It wasn't a direct answer to his plea, but it was something fundamentally real. And after weeks of hiding, real was enough. Without needing to discuss it further, they walked out of the sterile building and back into the biting October night. Elena pulled her dark green jacket over her shoulders as they headed toward Julian's parked car in the dim street. The drive to Riverside Park was mostly silent. It was a comfortable, necessary quiet, shared by two people who had nothing left to hide. They were returning to the origin. Some chapters needed a proper ending before a new one could genuinely begin. The park was completely desolate, the dark river moving continuously under the familiar, harsh yellow street lamps as they arrived. They found the old wooden bench easily, drawn to it by the undeniable gravity of an unfinished history. The bench was older than it should have been. The fading green paint was chipping badly at the iron armrests. One of the wooden slats had been replaced with wood that was slightly too light, like a bone that had healed wrong. They sat down together under the dim light. Julian naturally took the right side, Elena took the left. Neither of them pointed out that this was exactly how they had sat 10 years ago. Neither of them needed to. The river moved continuously in the cold night light, dark and unbroken, exactly the same river it had always been. The heavy silence finally broke when
Nothing
Elena
is
spoke,
ever
her
truly
voice
lost,
carrying no particular emotional
merely
weight, just a
redirected.
simple fact. "I
Foolish
still have
maybe,
the
but
scarf,"
I
she
kept
said
the
quietly,
letters.
her emerald
All of
eyes
them.
looking out at the dark,
I
moving
couldn't
water.
bring myself to burn them.
Julian turned to look at her, the vivid memory of the frayed blue scarf instantly returning to his mind. "It's
I
in
know
a box
just
somewhere,"
scarf.
she continued
But
softly.
I've held on to it
I
because
couldn't throw it
reminds me of
away.
everything we shared.
I just told myself it was a nice scarf. Julian sat entirely speechless. The realization that she had quietly held onto a physical piece of that night hit him like a physical force. He had spent 7 years believing he was entirely alone in his grief, only to find she had been silently anchoring herself to the exact same memory. The heavy, profound silence was suddenly interrupted by a sharp vibration. Julian's phone buzzed insistently in his coat pocket. He pulled it out. The bright screen illuminated his face in the darkness. It was a text from his 9-year-old daughter, Lily. She was asking if he was coming home for dinner, followed immediately by a highly specific, unprompted fact about bioluminescent deep-sea fish. Julian looked at the bright screen, and a deeply genuine, exhausted but profoundly warm smile spread across his face. He subtly tilted the phone so Elena could read it. She covered her mouth with her hand, a soft, genuine laugh escaping her. "She is a lot," Julian said, his voice thick with a father's quiet pride. Elena smiled warmly. "I know. I think I'm going to like her." Julian looked down at his phone and deliberately typed his reply, "Coming home. Bringing someone. Set out 3 plates." He put the phone away. Together, without needing to declare it, they stood up from the old wooden bench, leaving the ghosts of the past behind. They walked back to the car, leaving the river behind. The suffocating weight of a 10-year-old ghost had finally dissolved into the cold night air. The drive to the suburbs was smooth and quiet. Outside the passenger window, the harsh city lights gradually gave way to quieter, residential streets. Elena watched the passing neighborhoods. A subtle, unfamiliar sense of anticipation replaced the paralyzing exhaustion she had carried for so long. Julian navigated the familiar turns with an entirely new perspective. He wasn't driving back to an empty, silent fortress anymore. The car slowly pulled into his driveway. It was the exact same driveway where he had once stood, completely crushed by solitary grief. But tonight, the house wasn't dark. Warm, inviting light spilled from the living room windows, casting a golden glow onto the pavement. Julian turned off the engine. The sudden quiet of the car's interior marked the final threshold before their new reality began. He looked over at Elena, his deep blue eyes completely devoid of hesitation. "Ready?" he asked softly, offering a reassuring stillness. Elena took a slow, stabilizing breath, smoothing the collar of her green jacket. "Yes," she answered, her voice steady and grounded. They stepped out into the crisp October night, walking side by side toward the brightly lit front door, where a new chapter waited. Julian unlocked the front door. The metallic click echoed softly, marking the opening of a world he had kept firmly shut for 7 years. They stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood, entirely devoid of the tragic, sterile atmosphere Elena might have expected. There were shoes piled near the door and a chaotic stack of mail on the console table. It was the beautiful, messy evidence of survival. Light footsteps padded quickly across the hardwood floor above, followed by the appearance of a small figure at the top of the stairs. Lily Vance, 9 years old, stopped on the landing. She peered down through the wooden banister with a sharp, analytical gaze. She analyzed Elena with the intense, unedited scrutiny unique to children who have had to grow up a little too fast. Elena did not offer a high-pitched, fake greeting. She stood perfectly still, offering the child the respect of a quiet, equal presence. "Did he tell you about the Pacific football fish?" Lily asked directly, skipping all standard social pleasantries. Elena offered a small, genuine smile. "He mentioned they use bioluminescence to hunt. But I'd like to hear the rest." Julian leaned against the doorway, watching them. In that exact moment, the heavy, invisible ghost that had occupied his home finally vanished. The dining table was set for 3. It was a simple, ordinary arrangement that hadn't occurred in this quiet house for 7 years. Julian sat at the head of the table. He watched the scene unfold, feeling like a man slowly waking up from a decade-long winter. Lily sat directly across from Elena, her sharp blue eyes constantly observing the blonde woman over her plate. The 9-year-old launched into a highly detailed monologue about deep-sea pressure, deliberately testing the waters with her new guest. Elena didn't patronize the child. She listened with the exact same intense, professional focus she gave to adults facing a crisis. They survive by adapting to the absolute dark, Elena replied softly, cutting perfectly to the core of the unspoken metaphor. Lily stopped chewing. For the first time all evening, the child's rigid, fiercely protective posture finally softened. The little girl looked over at her father, offering a small, almost imperceptible nod of profound approval. Julian felt a sudden, sharp tightness in his chest, swallowed by an overwhelming wave of quiet, desperate gratitude. The heavy, suffocating silence of the past 7 years was finally replaced by the simple, beautiful clinking of silverware and gentle laughter. The dinner extended late into the evening. The conversation flowed easily, entirely devoid of the heavy awkwardness that usually accompanies forced introductions. Eventually, the exhaustion of the day caught up with the 9-year-old. Lily stood up, carefully collecting her empty ceramic plate. Before heading toward the stairs, she paused. She looked at Elena with her father's intense blue eyes and delivered a final verdict. "You can come back," the child stated matter-of-factly. It was the highest form of praise a guarded child could possibly offer. Elena nodded gravely, accepting the honor with perfect seriousness. Lily turned and disappeared up the wooden staircase. The adults were left alone in the warm glow of the dining room. Julian slowly began gathering the remaining silverware. It was an incredibly mundane, domestic chore. Yet, after 7 years of solitary cleanup, the presence of another person felt miraculous. Elena stood up to help him. They moved to the kitchen counter, standing shoulder to shoulder in a comfortable, synchronized rhythm. Julian turned off the faucet. He looked down at Elena, fully comprehending that the Denver relocation was officially abandoned. She caught his gaze, her emerald eyes reflecting the warm under-cabinet lights. The decision was firmly anchored in the quiet safety of his home. The kitchen was completely spotless, but neither of them was in any rush to leave the quiet sanctuary they had just created. Julian walked Elena back to the front entryway. The chaotic pile of shoes and mail now felt like a welcoming embrace. He opened the heavy wooden door, letting the crisp, biting October air wash over them one last time. "I'll call you tomorrow," Julian stated simply. There was no hesitation, no carefully constructed exit strategy. Elena paused on the porch. She pulled her dark green jacket tight, looking back at the warmly lit doorway. "I'll be here," she replied. It was a mundane response carrying the profound weight of a saved life. She walked toward her car. Julian remained on the porch, watching her with the quiet strength of a man finally at peace. 10 years ago, 2 broken strangers sat on a freezing park bench, completely unaware they were holding each other's lifelines. Tonight, the invisible ghosts of the past were officially laid to rest, replaced by the simple promise of a tomorrow. The door closed softly. The golden light from the European suburban home spilled into the dark street, steady, warm, and completely unbroken.